So welcome everyone to this latest in our distinguished lecture series, the Peter Kirstein Lecture. We've had some debate actually during the day as to whether this is the 5th or the 6th. Steve sort of assures me that it's the 6th. Before that we were thinking it might have been the 5th, but I think we'll go with the 6th. So for those that don't know, Peter Kirstein was the founding head of department of computer science back in the 1980s. And this lecture series was set up to commemorate and honour his life and work, particularly since his passing in 2020. Great pleasure to welcome members of Peter's family here. As always, a great turnout from you. Really great to see you come and support the event and enjoy it. Also great to, I think for the second year in a row, we're having this at UCL East, a kind of fairly recent venture for UCL. It's a new campus that's based around interdisciplinarity and collaboration. And I think we're really proud as computer science to have a big activity at the heart of that, reflecting how we touch on all corners of research and scientific discovery these days. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to hand over to the organising committee to introduce our speaker. But just a quick agenda for the day. So we'll hear from Tom after that. I guess you'll speak for, I don't want to preempt, I don't know, 40 minutes or something. Then we'll have a bit of Q&A. They will save questions to the end, and actually the way to do it is to scan the Slido code there, or it's also on the flyers that were handed out. So you can submit questions or vote up questions. Then we'll have a short break, and then we're going to convene a discussion panel after that. We've got a bunch of other guests, I think all of whom have a unique perspective on the topic that we're going to talk about today. So really looking forward to hearing that discussion. I think we'll get a lot of insight and unique ideas about that, so that will be nice. A little bit about the Kirstein lectures. So the format of this was really agreed by my predecessor, Steve Hales, as head of department. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Danny Alexander, I'm the head of department. My predecessor was Steve Hales, and it was really him and Peter, through discussions between them, that agreed the format for this lecture. And it's, I think it's really worked and taken shape over the last few years. Peter had a reputation as a really disruptive thinker. He liked to change things for what he saw as, as the better, and would put a lot of energy into doing that. And I think, since those discussions and Steve's period as head of department, he's really strove and succeeded in capturing the essence of that in the lecture series. The idea is that we try and invite speakers and topics that spark debate and create, new thinking. And I think that tradition's really upheld, and I'm sure that the topic of this year's talk will continue that too. Another part of the format was to try and ensure every year that the convene a committee of relative newcomers to the department to take the lead on the lecture from beginning to end, thinking about who to invite, doing the inviting, putting together the format of the day, and that was to keep the thinking fresh on the lecture and keeping it dynamic. So we've appointed 3 or 4 people each year to do that. This year, I think we offer a great debt of thanks to our 3 main organisers. That's Wei Chen, Tiki Bhatnagar, and Ramona Beravan. Particularly Ramona, actually, because we don't even pay you, do we? You're an honorary member of the department, so really appreciate the time that you've dedicated to this. And then our very special professional services contributors, in particular Sam and Victoria, who've done a massive job to organise all of this, and we really appreciate what you've done. We're going to let's give them a round of applause right now. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Wei, I believe, who's going to get proceedings underway and introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Danny. And thank you very much for the opportunity for me to be on the organising committee for the Peter Kirstein Lecture this year. Although I'm not a new face in the department anymore, but I'm still regarded as a new academic this year. And I was when I was first asked to join the panel, or join the organising committee, I was as nervous and as panicking as I'm now, not knowing what to do. And I think it was really the first session that we sat down and brainstormed together and trying to figure out what theme we focus on this year. And thankfully, I think Danny guided us and helped us reach consensus that to focus on this timely but very important topic for AI education for the topic to be this year. And we sat down and asked around from colleagues in the department, even beyond, about the list of names we wanted to invite to be able to speak today at this lecture. And we had Professor Tom Mitchell on the top of the list. We thought, okay, let's not hold off. Let's email him and ask him. And we got a positive response on the same day. So thank you, Tom. So it wasn't a very difficult job to start with, thankfully. And it wouldn't be a very difficult job for me to introduce Tom as well. I think it's a needless job for me to do. But regardless, let me quickly say that Professor Tom Mitchell is the Founders University professor from Carnegie Mellon University, where he actually established the Department of Machine Learning, the first one in the world, starting from 2006. Tom's work in AI and education speak for itself. And more lately, his research has been focusing on AI in education. And this is the topic he will be talking about today. And that's where AI is going to take education for us in 2030. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Tom Mitchell onto the stage.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here, to see you all here. Thank you for coming, especially Peter Kirstein's family. It's wonderful that you can attend this event. I have to tell you that for me, even though I've worked in AI for decades, I'm kind of a newcomer to AI in education because I hadn't really thought about education as an application of AI until 2018. And I happened to come to London in 2018 and attend the Learning Festival, which was a cluster of conferences around education. And I met a lot of very interesting people, and I got the bug, I have to say. So it's wonderful to be able to be here again in London 7 years later and be here with you all. So I want to talk about where I think maybe education can take us by 2030. And I'll tell you right up front, here's my thesis. My thesis is if AI is ever going to make a difference, this is the decade when it's going to make a big impact on education. I have three reasons why I think this. The first is that we've known for a very long time, since at least 1984, that if we can give individual students an individual human tutor, not a computer tutor, a human tutor, then we can dramatically improve their performance. Bloom wrote this article claiming 2 sigma improvement in students who got individual tutoring compared to students who just sat in a general classroom. People have debated whether it's really 2 sigma, whether it holds in all cases. It doesn't hold in all cases. Sometimes it's not 2 sigma. It doesn't matter. What matters is if you have an individual tutor, you do better. That's point 1. Point 2 is we finally have computer systems that are being used by millions, literally millions, of students. Why is that important? That's important because what it means is we have computer systems that are gaining more experience about how to teach than a human teacher could ever get in a 100-year career. And machine learning ought to be able to help us take advantage of that greater volume of experience. The third point is one I know I don't have to convince you of. AI progress is accelerating. If you've been paying attention for the last 5 years, you probably agree with me on that. So for these 3 reasons, it seems to me the time is ripe and we ought to be able to do something pretty interesting. So let me begin by saying what I mean by having a lot of data on student learning. Here's the front page of a nonprofit organization in California called CK12. You can go to their website, free of charge, no paywall. You can access kindergarten through 12th grade online education materials. As you see in their front page, they've had over 200 million student visits. It's a lot of students. That adds up to 40 million hours of student learning time. Whoops. 40 million hours, I did the arithmetic, is a lot of centuries. This is more data than I will ever experience as a human teacher. Okay, what does that data look like? It looks like this. This is actually data from a Chinese learning company called Squirrel AI, a great company. The point is, this is log data describing what one particular student did in a 1 hour, 49-minute lesson that they took online. And they began by being pre-tested. So each row in the log data here, I know it's too small to see, that's okay. Each row in this log data is describing a question they were asked in the pre-test. It's describing how long it took them to answer the question, what their answer was, whether it was right or wrong. And so this log data is telling us that. After that, the students looked at some material. This student watched a video. Then they solved some practice questions, studied solution. At the end, they got a post-test. You get the idea. For each student coming through, we know at this level of detail exactly what they did. So now the question is, what can we do with this data? And now if you're a machine learning person and you see that kind of volume of data, you think, oh, great, what can we do? Well, my quick take on education is that there are two fundamental problems in education: diagnosis and therapy. First, we want to diagnose, what does this student know? And then we want to choose the right therapy to help them know more. So let's look at what can we do with this data if we're interested in student diagnosis, which is, to put another way, how can we use machine learning algorithms and that data to learn to diagnose the student's knowledge state at any particular point in that trajectory that they're going through online. So we have their log data up to some time t. We'd like to know, what do they understand and not understand? To make that operational, I'm going to turn that into which of 1,000 questions that we could ask the student at this point, which of those questions can they answer correctly at this point? Or more subtly, with what probability will they answer this question correctly? So to turn this into a machine learning question, we want to learn to predict the probability that the student will correctly answer question K for all K. For each different question, we want to learn this, given their student log data up to this point. Now we can learn this from all the log data of the previous students who came through, because for those students, we can look at their learning trajectory, arbitrarily pick up time t, and say, well, up till then they had behaved like this. They had gotten these questions right, these ones wrong. They had watched this video partway through. And now they turned out to be able to answer question 42 correctly, but not question 13. So we can use that as training data to train a model of some kind. And we ran experiments. We tried to train neural networks, logistic regression, your favorite machine learning algorithm, but basically to learn these probabilities of being correct. Now, how well does this work? Well, one way to answer that question, one way to test our models that have been trained, is we'll take a new student who this thing has never been trained on. We'll give it log data up to some time t. We know for the new student that they were able to answer, let's say, this question, but not this question. So we'll give the model two questions, and we'll ask it to tell us which one did they answer correctly and which one incorrectly. Now, if you guess at random, how well are you going to do? 50%, right? There are only two choices. So if you guess at random, you'll get 50%. We ran this program on 4 different, very large educational data sets. Each one had tens of millions of student log data rows. And on average, here was how accurate the system was. Random guessing, again, 50%. If we actually ignore the history of this particular new student, we can do better than 50% because we can look at, of these 2 questions we're being asked about, which one did most students get correct and which ones did most students get incorrect. So if we just make the prediction for this new student based on what the average of old students did, that 50% goes up to 71. But if we actually use our model, which pays attention to the log data of the new student up to this point, then that goes up to 81%. And this is basically roughly the state of the art of being able to do this kind of diagnosis of which questions the student will at this point be able to answer correctly and incorrectly. 8 times out of 10, given 2 questions, we can tell, or our model can predict accurately, which one the student will be able to answer. So that's diagnosis. Now the therapy question, of course, is what do we do about it? What kind of teaching action do we want to give to the student in order to teach them well? We decided when we were looking at this problem to pick a particular case study, which is which hint should we show to a student if they just answered a question incorrectly, but before they try it a second time. And we defined a good hint as being one that would both increase their chance of answering it correctly when they tried again, but also increase as much as possible their overall score on the entire homework assignment that this question was part of. So there's the question the therapy question we're looking at in this case is this one example of learning to choose which hints to give to the student. Okay, now here's an example of the kind of data we used. We partnered with CK12, that California nonprofit, to work with their data and their online students. Maybe you can't read this question, I'll read it to you. It's from a high school biology course. Integral monotopic proteins are permanently attached to the membrane from the cytoplasm, one side, both sides, or the middle of the membrane. Now you probably know the answer, but if you don't, and you got the wrong answer the first time, we have, in this case, 4 different hints that we could provide to you. These are authored by well-intentioned teachers, but nobody knows which hint works best. They're just authored by well-intentioned teachers. So the first hint, for example, says the prefix mono means single or alone. That's a hint we could give you before you try this question again. And there are other hints. This last one is basically defining vocabulary items for you like cytoplasm and protein. Okay, so now what can we do? Well, remember that log data. We could collect some special log data, and we did. We ran an experiment, and we found out the hint 1 is the best hint. The way we found that out is for 142 days, we instrumented the system so that whenever a question was answered incorrectly, the student got uniformly at random one of these 4 hints. So in the end, we could tell which hint led students on average to a better learning outcome, a better, more correct answers the second time, and better overall lesson score. So the big data that we get from these logs of many students actually allow us to directly determine which hint is best. We could use that data to learn a strategy or a policy for delivering the right hint for the right question across all students. We did that, and in fact, when we compared that against what CK12 had previously been doing, we found it worked a lot better. So the system was deployed and is now part of the routine CK12 online system. This learning algorithm is run weekly now, not just for the biology course we started with, but half a dozen additional courses that CK12 offers. Okay, so where are we here? Let me step back and summarize. The point really here so far is once we have teaching platforms that are being used by millions of students, we get big data about what students are doing and how they're reacting to different teaching actions they could be exposed to. And we can use that with our machine learning algorithms to learn both how to diagnose and how to pick the right therapy for particular kinds of teaching action. This is one of the reasons why I really do believe by 2030 we're going to be, there's no reason why we can't implement this on a wide scale. It's just that we haven't bothered to do it yet. It can be done. But it leads to a really interesting observation and question. The observation is, notice the learning techniques, the machine learning algorithms we used here. Never looked at the text of the question. They never looked at the text of the hint. They just looked at the statistics. Question 42, hint number 1 worked best on average, but they never looked at the text. Now that it's 2025 and we have systems, large language models like GPT, large language models like GPT, Gemini, and others, it leads to the obvious question, can we get these systems, which really do analyze and interpret text, to look at the content of the question, the text of the question, and the text of the hint, and predict which hint will work best? Completely orthogonal to the statistical approach we introduced. Okay, so we tried it, and the answer is 60 to 65% of the time, again, 50% would be random, this ChatGPT can correctly predict 60 to 65% of the time which of two hints for a fill-in-the-blank question is going to work better. And again, we're using the same statistical data that we collected in the experiment with CK12 to tell us what ground truth really is in terms of which hint it's really better. Okay, so that's pretty good, but not that good. So which leads to the question, well, can we train an LLM-based system to do this task better? So we worked on this for a while, and we came up with the following new kind of machine learning algorithm, which involves 3 computer agents, I will call them. Each computer agent is a little computer program that gets to call GPT-4 as a subroutine. And this learning algorithm is a collection of 3 such agents. The first one I'll call the prediction agent. Its job is that it's given a question like this one. The transfer of energy from a vibrating object in waves that travel through matter is called fill in the blank. And then it's given 2 hints. For example, this first one says energy, the ability to do work. And a second hint, which you don't have to read, it's very verbose. Okay, but the job of the prediction agent is given a question and 2 hints, predict which one is going to work better. All right. The second agent also gets to use GPT-4, but its input is different. its input is what the first agent did. It gets to look at the input and the output of the prediction agent. And it also gets told what the truth is. Remember, we have the data. We collected the statistics. We know, in this case, hint 2 is better than hint 1 in terms of statistically the outcomes of students. So agent number 2, I'll call it the critic because its job is literally to critique the first agent, given what it knows to be the correct answer. And what's the form of that output? It's natural language text. So for example, here is literally the output of the critique agent. I'll read it to you. The prediction was incorrect. It's talking about the prediction agent's job. The prediction was incorrect. In this case, the more helpful hint was hint 2, which provided a concrete example and explanation related to the concept being asked about in the question. And then importantly, the bold font is mine, not it. More importantly, it gives us a general principle that's illustrated in this case. It says, a general principle to keep in mind for future predictions is that providing concrete examples and explanations related to the concept being asked about in the question is often more helpful than providing abstract definitions or explanations. So the critique looks like this. Okay, now, we actually have a lot of examples, not just this one question and hint pair. So in this experiment, we collected, for 125 different examples, we collected these critiques. And then we used the third agent. The third computer agent, again, gets to use GPT-4. It's a subroutine. But its job is to distill the 125 critiques that come from those examples into a distilled list of principles without repetition. A rubric, if you will, for what makes a good hint. And its output looks like this. It comes up with a list, in this case, from those 125 examples of 7 principles. And they look like this. Let's just read the first one. The first one says, connection to practical applications. In subjects like physics or chemistry, where abstract concepts must be applied to real-world phenomena, prioritize explanations that directly connect these concepts to their practical applications. This approach aids comprehension and helps students see the relevance of what they're learning, enhancing their understanding and retention of the material. So this is the final outcome of our learning algorithm. It's a rubric, a list of principles that these 3 agents collaborating and getting this labeled data from our experiment comes up with. Now, is this rubric any good? You might ask. Well, one way to test would be, let's give this rubric back to that first performance agent. And we'll have it make predictions where it's also told this rubric as guidance for how to make predictions. When we do that, the performance agent accuracy goes from originally 67% without the rubric to 84% with the rubric. And we see similar improvements on separate test data. So what's going on here is we've got this system that's combining now the statistical data of which hints actually do work best on average across many students historically, with the language capabilities and shallow reasoning capabilities of large language models like GPT-4 to produce a rubric, which, when we give it back to the performance agent, actually improves its performance. Notice also what's interesting about this compared to many machine learning algorithms. We're not learning a lot of different numbers. We're learning natural language text, a list of principles. Why is that important? One reason that's important is if you're a teacher or even a bystander who thinks you have a better idea, You can edit this list of principles. You can make up your own principle and add it. If you think they're bad ones, you can edit them. And we could take your list of principles and we can run the same test on it and see if your principles lead to more or less accuracy than this list. So it's a kind of learning that produces human interpretable, editable output. So this also leads, of course, to the question, if this is a good rubric, why use it only to rank hints that were generated by teachers? Why don't we also use it to generate new hints? So we began an experiment giving these principles to GPT-4. For example, one question, here's a typical question. It's a fill in the blank, fill in the sentence with the word droplets, ice, or vapor. The question is, in the water cycle, water, droplets, ice, or vapor, in the atmosphere may condense around tiny particles and form clouds. Okay, now think about what hint you would make up for this question. Here's the hint generated by GPT-4 using that learned rubric. It says, think about the state of water that's present in the atmosphere before it condenses to form clouds. Is it in a solid, liquid, or gaseous state? Consider the process of condensation and what form water must be in to undergo this change. When I look at that, I think it's a reasonable hint. It's as good as I could do. And when I look at the 1,000 or so questions for which we've had hints generated, I think pretty much the same thing. They look reasonable to me. Of course, the proof of the pudding would be to give these to students in the same kind of experiment that we used at the beginning on the human-generated hints. And we haven't yet done that. We're trying to work with CK12 to see whether we can run that experiment. But this is how far we've gotten. So again, if you step back, this is showing that we can combine the statistical log data that we have for many students with the language and shallow reasoning capabilities of language model to come up with human interpretable list of principles, a rubric, and use that both to rank hints more accurately and to produce hints which we have not yet had a chance to test. So that's where we are. Okay, so where does this whole thing now lead us? If you think about now all the topics we've covered in the talk, I think what it leads us to is a vision of online teaching platforms that improve every single day. They have the property that the more they teach, the better they teach, because they're able to use the data that they capture from students from routine use of the system. There's no extra data labeling going on here. It's routine use of the system that's giving us this log data. And they're able to learn continuously in several different ways. They can learn to better diagnose the student knowledge state. We talked about statistical method to do that. Learn to choose which therapy to apply, which hint in this case, but it could also be which practice question to show the student next. There are many teaching actions. The case study we looked at was hints. They could learn rubrics, as we just saw, to evaluate the effectiveness of new content. We showed it for evaluating effectiveness of hints, but it could be for evaluating which question we should ask the student next, which video we should show them next. The same techniques, similar techniques could apply. We see, in principle, we can get the system to learn to generate new content, although we haven't yet been able to test the quality of that new content. But importantly, all of this can also be done in collaboration with human teachers and educators who can edit those rubrics if they want, who can suggest new hints if they want, can suggest new content, new videos, new questions. And that human-suggested content can compete in the evaluation against computer-generated content. And I'm sure in some cases one will win, in other cases others. We want the best of breed no matter where it comes from. So this, I think, is actually, if you get nothing else out of this talk, then here's a sketch for the kind of online education systems we could build in the next 5 years and have deployed. That's my main point. Okay, now I can't help myself but take a few minutes to talk about some slightly wilder ideas, because we are at the stage where now that computers can handle text in with amazing capabilities compared to before, and images and lots of things, there's a wonderful wellspring of creativity right now in the education field, where people are making up all kinds of experimental systems for education. And I would say we're at the point where these are very interesting systems. We don't yet know which ones are actually going to be most helpful to students, but that's okay. Right now, we're just kind of generating a lot of ideas. One of the ideas that you see in several places, including the current version of the CK12 system that I mentioned, is old-style educational material with a chatbot next to it. And so the chatbot name is Flexi in the case of CK12. But as the student is going through this biology material, there's a chatbot next to it, which is an expert on that material and can answer questions, can have a discussion with the student about the content. So that's one idea that many people are experimenting with. Here's a different idea that actually comes from one of my PhD students, Robin Schmucker. He said, well, now that we can have conversations with computers, why don't we build a system where humans learn by teaching? We'll have, if you've ever taught a course, you know the very best way to learn material is to teach a course. Why don't we have humans learn by teaching a student bot, which is based on GPT-4. And so he built a system where on one panel, the human gets to look at this material. In another panel, the human gets to have a conversation with a student bot who is asking questions about the material. Now there's another bot, in addition to the student bot, there's also a professor bot that, unlike the student bot, which is pretending it doesn't know the material, the professor bot is an authority on the material. And if the human gets stuck trying to teach the student bot, you can always fall back and the professor bot can give help. So we ran it, we built a system and ran it, some human studies with about 36 students. What we found was the students loved this compared to doing it the old-fashioned way. Number two, we found out that it took way longer for them to teach the student bot than it took them the old-fashioned way to learn the material. And third, we found that they scored about the same on the final test. So, you know, like I say, there are a lot of experiments to be done. Some of them will turn out positive results. Some require some refinement. Let me show you one of my most favorite, not invented here, things. I don't know how many of you have seen Google Notebook LM. It's pretty amazing because you can give it a PDF file like this lesson that I screen scraped from CK12 about muscles. You can give it a PDF file like that. It will turn it into a podcast between two imaginary people. Let me play you the podcast that I got from this.
You know, it's funny, we do all these incredible things with our bodies every day and rarely stop to think about how it all actually works.
Yeah, totally.
Like even just taking a step or lifting your hand. So for today's deep dive, we're going to zoom in on one of those fundamental processes.
Okay,
you know, it's funny, we do all these incredible things with our bodies every day and rarely stop to think about how it all actually works.
I'm going to request another 33 seconds
like
for my
even just
time. Okay. Sorry, I was just trying to pause there because I was going to say, it's amazing enough that you put in a PDF file like that and you get this very engaging podcast out. What comes next is that you can interrupt the podcast. You can interrupt those two speakers and ask a question. And that's what you're about to hear me interrupt them and ask a question. I'll try to fast forward us to about where we were.
We're going to zoom in on one of those fundamental processes, muscle contraction. We're going deep with this scientific document about how muscles...
Oh, hey, our listener wants to join in. What's up?
Hey, I'd like to know, what is the strongest muscle in the human body?
That's a great question. It's something people often wonder about.
And it's a bit more complex than it sounds, actually.
Right. Because what does strongest even mean? Is it the one that can lift the most weight?
Exactly. If we're talking about the muscle that can exert the most force in a single contraction, pound for pound,
Okay.
then the masseter muscle, which is in your jaw and used for chewing, is often cited.
Wow, the chilling muscle. That's surprising.
It really is. Think about the pressure you can generate when you bite down.
Makes sense. But what if we're talking about endurance?
Okay, you get the idea. This is totally amazing to me, but think of it as an educational tool. By the way, there was nothing in that PDF file that mentioned what the strongest muscle in the body was. So I was going off script when I asked that question, but it was able to do what chatbots do and come up with the answer, and it is the correct answer. And so now think of this as a kind of educational tool that allows you to direct the conversation, but primed with some document that has the content you want to cover. Okay, I'll wind up quickly, but my fourth and final example is one that I only ran across about 2 weeks ago, when one of my friends said I had to look at this, so I did. It's a prototype website, but you can go to this. It's called videotutor.io, and it will ask you what you want a tutorial about. And so I typed in, teach me about VC dimension in machine learning. VC dimension, by the way, is the kind of theoretical property of learning systems that's used to central in some of the theory of machine learning, but it's not common knowledge to people who aren't in that field. Within 5 minutes, it produced a tutorial, which you see on the right side, along with quiz questions to test your understanding at the end, and interface to a chatbot where you could ask more questions. So to me, this says, are we going to face a future where we can get customized, precise, targeted tutorials on topics we want to learn about? If we do, what does it say about things like the CK12 pre-canned lessons? What's the interaction between textbooks and these kind of tutorial systems? Much to be determined. Okay, and there are more, but I won't go into them. So let me end by just kind of summarizing where we've been here. We've seen many opportunities to leverage AI on screen and off the screen. I didn't cover too much off screen, but there are other people working on things like computer vision based systems that will watch teams of students performing simple physics experiments. We've seen a lot of opportunity there. And again, much of this still has to be evaluated to see to what degree it really helps. Beyond the technology, though, there are a lot of non-technical issues about how are we going to be able to get the good ideas out of this technology absorbed into the educational system. We're going to have to deal with things like state teaching standards, concerns of teachers, parents, students. How are we going to make this attractive to schools? And again, the final point, I think if you get nothing else out of the talk, I want you to get the idea that we actually have the technology today to build systems that the more they teach, the better they teach, because they can use that log data that's collected from routine use of the system to learn how to teach better. So I think we're going to have time to have some questions, and followed by a panel discussion that'll be then more wide-ranging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for sharing the latest tools, experiments, and research you're doing, and bring it with us just out of the oven. I think it makes us all think a bit more about different types of learning from different perspectives. As most of us are computer scientists, think about how we make machine learning and how we make students learn better but smarter, and how we can teach, and the better we teach when we teach more. Another round of applause. Thank Tom for And now can I bring my fellow colleagues from the committee, Tiggy and Ramona as well, to bring us some questions we have received, both online and of course in person as well.
Thank you, Wei, and thank you, Professor Tom. We have received a bunch of questions online, and there are definitely quite a few burning questions in the crowd. So, we'll take one question from Slido. I think that will help us set the scene, and then we'll come to the audience. Not okay? Cool. So, Professor Tom, an anonymous question here. Expert teachers diagnose not only what students know, but also how they feel, and what they do or how they can be supported. How does AI fit with this scenario?
It's a great question, and we don't know the full answer to what will AI be able to capture and not be able to capture. We don't know where that dividing line will be. We do know that if we have log data, and there's some event in the log data that we'd like to be able to predict, we know that we have machine learning algorithms that, given enough data, are going to be able to do that to some degree. How a student learns, is that in the log data? You tell me. The log data has how many videos you watched. Actually, the log data I put up on the screen, the student watched one video all the way through, and the second video they started, but they bailed about a third of the way through. That's in the log data. So we know that about the student. That same example log data had the student reviewing the answers to the questions they got wrong. We know how long they spent reviewing each of those. We know what text they looked at. Is that enough? I don't know, but you could imagine, for example, quite easily we could have a system that learns how video dependent is this student or that student. How much do they focus on studying the correct answers after they make mistakes, those kind of properties. But what I'm doing is I'm articulating very targeted properties that I can see are in the log data. And I think as a teacher myself, there are a lot of things that I can't quite articulate, but probably subconsciously think about it as a student. And I don't know whether we're going to be able to get there.
Thank you, Professor, for a very insightful lecture. My name is Zubair. I'm a founder of an edtech company called Znotes. We serve over 6 million learners with support for high-stakes exams. And the approach we've taken is peer-led content creation and learning. A lot of the tools that we're seeing in AI in education right now are very one-to-one focused, where there's a student and an AI bot having an interaction, whether that is to the podcast you showed, or a Q&A, or a teacher or a student bot. Have you and your team experimented where there is a multimodality, where we're considering multiple students and a single AI, and to make it more radical, multiple students and multiple AI with different models that can actually have discourse, disagreements, debate, and further instruction and impact in social and academic outcomes. So I was wondering if you'd thought a little bit about that and curious to learn that.
That's a great direction for research. My group has really focused on primarily on one-to-one, one computer, one student. As you say, much of learning that students do is in teams or involve various projects. They have many different components. And we haven't looked at that in our group, but the field has. There are, for example, at University of Colorado, I know that in Boulder, there's a $20 million AI center funded by the National Science Foundation in the US that focuses specifically on teams of elementary and secondary students working at a table, and they put an AI device that looks a lot like Alexa in the center of the table as a participant in the discussion. And so there are a lot of experiments, for example, that they're looking at, even as simple as having the computer agent detect if somebody is doing all the talking and somebody's doing none of the talking, then just to be able to step in and encourage somebody else to, are there any other ideas to be heard, kind of thing. But lots of, you can imagine a lot of directions for that to go. So short answer, my group, okay, I'm about to make it a longer answer. We haven't gone there, but there's a lot of very interesting exploration there. The reason we haven't got there is I'm thinking about how are we going to get this into education systems. And I've talked to enough teachers who don't particularly want computers in their classrooms. And I'm thinking the way this is going to get into the classroom is through homework. Because every teacher loves the idea of self-graded homework. And when you think about how primitive our homeworks are today, right? I give everybody in the class the same paper that has the same 5 questions on it. That's crazy. If we can have computers instead give everybody the first question, and then if you get that one right, you get a different second question than if you get that wrong. And maybe you get a tutorial and some hints along the way. So I think once we have students doing online homeworks, we will be able to find out exactly how far can AI go to help. Because we can turn this really not much fun kind of answering of the questions into a learning experience if we are creative enough. So the reason that my group is focusing on the one-to-one is that I'm thinking homeworks are the way this whole thing is going to get into the education system. Sorry for that.
One more question from the audience.
Hello, first of all, it's nice to meet you and thank you for the lecture, it's been great. As a student myself, I've literally just finished my A-levels and I'm about to go into university. One of the main concerns surrounding AI in education as a whole is students using it to plagiarize as opposed to actually learn. So how, and there's a lot of, I'm sure you're aware, discourse around it, how would it be possible that, like, potentially would AI in education, how can we use that to fuel innovation rather than just learning the same things over and over again?
Yeah, plagiarism you bring up really is an issue. It's a serious issue in high schools and colleges. I think what's going to happen there is analogous to what happens with calculators, with the introduction of calculators. When they were introduced, there was general concern that maybe people would cheat on arithmetic homeworks and use calculators instead. And maybe they would never learn how to add correctly or multiply correctly. What happened, so that was like 1980-ish when calculators were beginning to pervade society. What happened? Well, here we are in 2025. We didn't get rid of calculators. We still teach kids arithmetic. We don't allow them to have a calculator on the exam. But when they get into college and they're learning engineering, we teach them how to use the calculators to make them better engineers. So I think we're going to see analogous things in the case of AI. We're not going to allow students to use ChatGPT when they take the exam. They're going to have to write their own essay then. Although we may, in fact, have things like Conmigo help students learn how to write better essays. When it comes to test time, we're not going to allow the use of that. But then, in the end, we want everybody to learn how to take advantage of this AI tool to make themselves smarter, more effective. So I think a lot about calculators as an analogy. I don't think we have all the answers, but I think there's some clues there from calculators.
Thank you so much.
Any more questions from the audience?
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's wonderful. When we talk about AI, you also talk about personalized learning. So since you have such a big data, sometimes different people learn differently. Is it possible that you also get some data about the user so that the hint can be tailor-made to the people or answer the questions so that you help them more based on their background or other personal information?
Yeah, there is much more opportunity to personalize than I talked about here. For example, GPT and Gemini, all of these current state-of-the-art models, are actually very good at rewriting a question to fit an interest that a student has. So for example, you take a math word problem, like Bill drove from point A to B at 30 miles an hour while Joe drove at 60 miles an hour in the other direction. Where do they meet? I actually gave a question like that to GPT, and I said, rewrite it for somebody who's a soccer player. And it gave me back a question that pretty much said, Sue and Ann were friends but played on opposite teams. When they showed up on opposite sides of the field, Sue, who ran twice as fast as Ann, they ran toward each other and they hugged in the middle of the field. Where were they? So systems are already quite good at, say, customizing, rewriting, keeping the same underlying math problem, but rewriting to customize to your interests, be it soccer or baseball or rock music or whatever. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for customizing content to your interest. I think also the better we get at diagnosing and tracking what students really know and don't know, there's a big opportunity, we haven't gotten there yet, to really make education much more efficient by not reteaching the stuff that you already know. And so I think those are two very different dimensions among the maybe many ways that we can see personalization come.
We'll take one last question from the audience.
Thank you. I think along similar lines, it would be really interesting to understand as well if there are particular contexts in which people learn better. For instance, student A might learn better in the morning at home, another might work better in the library at night. So understanding those things would be really helpful in working out how best to support an individual in their learning.
That's a great suggestion. And I'll just say that I do know the CK12 people who run this website 24 hours a day do have data about when students are doing this, but I'm not sure the students are necessarily doing it when it's best for them. But maybe they have enough data that they could at least form some hypotheses about when you should do your homework.
Excellent. I think that brings us to the end of the question and answer session post-talk. We'll now hand it over back to Daniel for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So I shan't dwell on this. I'm going to pass straight over to Kaska to introduce herself and the rest of our esteemed panel.
Thank you. I'm wired, apparently. I hope I am. It's a great pleasure to have you all here for this panel, and thank you, Tom, for a wonderful talk. We will start with the introductions. I am Kaska Porayska-Pomsta. I'm Professor of AI in Education at UCL. I'm also Director of the UCL Knowledge Lab, where we specialize in building technologies and evaluating them. And I calculated that we have probably about 80 years of combined expertise in AI in education. And we have also been responsible for the Festival of Learning. So we are very happy. I'm very happy to hear that this has had such an important impact. Since we already have had Tom being introduced, if you don't mind, Tom, we will go around the panel for the introductions. So starting with Ivana, if you could introduce yourself, please.
So hi, everybody. So my name is Ivana Drobnjak. I'm a professor in computational healthcare. I'm also director of the undergraduate program in the Department of Computer Science and a member of UNESCO Chair in AI.
Thank you. Matthew?
Hi, can everyone hear that? Or can you hear me over here? Okay. I'm Matthew Pryor. I'm founder of Graffinity. We were one of the companies awarded part of the £1 million by the Department for Education for their recent launch of their content store and for an AI tools and education company project. And as part of that, we've collaborated and were collaborating already with UCL Advanced Research Computing Center, the Institute of Education, and the Knowledge Lab as well, and had originally come through the UCL Center of Digital Innovation.
Hi, I'm Daniel Rothschild. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here. My main interest is language and its connection to AI, and I'm going to start running our new undergraduate program in philosophy and computer science next year.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the introduction. So as you see, we have a very diverse panel here today. And what we will be talking about broadly is the future of AI in education. So we had Tom introduce us to the field, if you like. So I will start with you, Tom, if that's all right, with the first question. You talked about AI as this kind of almost inevitable thing. My question to you is it desirable? So, do we, and if so, in what way? So really what I'm interested to hear about is whether we have fully interrogated what makes AI in education desirable. Are we following what is needed on the ground, or are we responding to the availability of technology?
Great. That's a great question, and I think honestly we're doing some of both. Why did I end up presenting the examples that I did? Largely that's because there is this existing platform or set of platforms out there that provide a certain kind of education to students, to kindergarten through 12th grade students. And partly I was looking under the lamppost, and the lamppost was the system. And that's the kind of data that was available, is available, will, I think, be available in greater quantities going forward. And so in that sense, we were piggybacking. The reason we went there is we were piggybacking on this existing system. But I take the existence of that system as evidence of its utility. There's a reason why 200 million student visits came to that website. And by the way, part of the reason is that many teachers assign homework on that website, which does the auto grading in addition to the things that I mentioned. So I think partly there. But when I think about where AI will and will not play a role in education. I think it will be good at certain types of things, like helping with homework, because the bar is so low. Homework is so bad right now to begin with. It's easy to beat that. But will it replace teachers in 4th grade classrooms? No way, because more than half of what a 4th grade teacher does is motivate the student to want to learn. And computers are currently terrible at that. And so, education is a very multifaceted activity, and we need to work maybe a little harder than we have. We've been opportunistic. We need to work hard to figure out where does it genuinely improve things, and I think homework is at least my shining example. And where should we just not even bother? And I think, for example, motivation doesn't seem to be it for me.
Well, so thank you very much. And actually, this whole question about improvement. So we obviously build those systems with the hope that we will be improving education. But I think there is still a question about whose vision of improvement are we relying on. So Ivana, I was wondering whether maybe you could kind of respond to this challenge of improving education and kind of the question of whether we have taken the whole diversity, the whole spectrum of learning needs and contexts into account in order to be able to confidently talk about improvement through AI.
So it's a really great question. And actually, before I answer that, I think I'm just going to mention one of the really big characteristics, how I see AI, which is kind of very important to answer this. And that is that AI is just this really big amplifier. That's a really important characteristic of AI. So anything good or anything bad that is happening, I think, in our society, AI can amplify. And so, for example, in terms of improvement, that question already exists in the human education without any AI. It is like, what is it that we are trying to improve, and what criteria are we using to measure the improvement? So, there is the whole idea of, preparing for exams and getting better and better and answering questions, getting better mark. And that's one way of assessing and one way of measuring improvement. But there's all these other aspects of education which are extremely difficult to measure, and that's also extremely important, such as creativity, thinking outside of the box, being able to connect, being able to even understand what the problem is that is worth solving. So these things are very hard to measure, and we know, and even the educator right now in our education are struggling to teach students this, and we are as a society struggling to measure those kind of things. So what AI is going to do really is just going to amplify this current failing of ours. And so this is why we need to be we need to understand this and find a way of solving this. And which really brings us back to that one really big point is design table. It's how do we design AI? We really need to understand our own human characteristics. And so when we design AI, we need to be able to take them into account and make sure that these things are addressed in the design itself. And so now how this thing with improvement needs to be designed, well, we need at that table to have a range of different stakeholders, range of different people to help us create those values. So not, it's tech developers, but also education scientists, policymakers, learners themselves, teachers, so to help us define what is it that we want to improve, and then to help us actually design and put that into the algorithm.
So we need involvement of everyone who is who basically is a stakeholder in this in this context. And so that brings me to another question. Maybe Matthew, you could pick this question up, because just following on what Ivana has just kind of signaled, we do talk about co-design. We do talk about stakeholders and the critical importance of their involvement in designing AI in education, responsible AI in education. We do consider this an important aspect, and also engaging in this design responsibly. But practically speaking, how meaningful can this participation be when we see, and this is, I guess, where your expertise also comes in as entrepreneur, when a lot of what we're doing is actually driven by commercial incentives, if I can put it this way. So how do we ensure that there is that we foster authentic agency for teachers, for learners, and that these technologies actually support meaningful learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big question, and it's part of a bigger question. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit earlier with Tom. What's education for? And until we're not going to get an answer to that, maybe until we sort of have a better idea of what we want society to look like. So, but we can park some of that because we're not going to get perfect straight away, but we can get to better. And I think, what do I think? Better looks like incentivization. So I'm right at the beginning. I used to be a journalist, and so I've been doing this for sort of 4 to 5 years of working around education. And we've got this startup now, and I think an ecosystem that incentivizes good behavior, good principles from companies would be a massive step forward. And some of that already exists. And who knows, the content store, the Department for Education content store, and the other things that they're doing might be part of building that trust with an idea that the data that's coming from the curriculum and from students and from all of these different sources, that is in theory going to make it possible to make large language models, but AI generally more accurate. That's one of the sort of underpinning tests that this whole process this whole project is going through, not just ours. But if you create a kind of idea that data can be social rather than just privately owned, then maybe we can do some things, more interesting things around that. Maybe we can build an ecosystem of teachers, of government, of edtech companies, of research institutions, where there are certain requirements to gain entry. If you want to have access to some of the student data, if you want to have access to schools, perfectly possible to just incentivize that. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to turn into angels, and there'll be companies existing outside of that, and there are companies designing tools that are being used in education that weren't for education. There are all these problems, but I think it would radically make lots of people fall into line if what you were giving them was this huge access to data sets, if the wins that they could have at great speed to move fast and break things or whatever they want to do. Because I mean, we're you know, the other way to look at it is that we're trying to go through a model of evidence-based research through the CDI, creating tools potentially that other people can use, but also to go, okay, here is trust in the process we've gone through. And to give you an example, the Chartered Institute for Teachers, I've got that slightly wrong, but they produced a stat on Monday at a talk I was at that 8% of teachers think that teachers have 8% of trust in the claims made by edtech tools. And I think that's probably not far off, because when we're looking through the evidence bases of competitors, or, you know, we start seeing things like, we're doing evaluation of context maps using with AI supported evaluation for teachers as a formative assessment tool. So the DFE store is explicitly not and the project is not summative assessment and not private tutor. And you see things like people claiming this improves children's memory by 400%. I mean, that's like Trump claiming that he's reduced the price of eggs by 400%. It's sort of meaningless statistic. So I think I said I was giving a short answer, but that's a long way of saying that that you can incentivize and you can get to a much better place much quicker, and then we can start answering the big questions.
Right. So incentives is one thing that kind of keeps coming back in various discussions that we're hearing, especially around the tech. So that's really great to bring those up. Daniel, just kind of elaborating on all of the questions and answers that we had. I mean, it's obvious that the development of technology, especially now with generative AI, an area that you're researching especially, is moving really, really fast. And we have been warned about the fast pace of technology development, at least since the 60s, since Wiener, right? How do we actually prevent the fact that certain things are technically feasible from entrenching us in doing things that may not be necessarily beneficial specifically for learners and for their experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that suggests a kind of, I mean, Tom said something which really interested me, where he said he was focusing on homework because teachers were so resistant to using AI in other ways that he wanted to do it someplace that accepted it. And I'm sure that's true. But I think, you know, when you show the kind of fancy new toys that LLMs do, like creating, I mean, you can create a podcast, but you can easily just imagine that's adapted just creating a lesson automatically. I think that resistance is going to crumble in the face of tools that do your work for you. And I think, as you say, I mean, so I take the risk you're worried about is just, I mean, or at least one risk that's made is just teachers are going to stop doing what they do. I put as much work in because they're going to think I just press a button and it's going to do it. And I think, you know, this is a massive worry. And I think, you know, I mean, we have this, you read about it socially in lots of domains, but I think it's a particularly strong worry in education because we don't really, I mean, having listened to, for instance, the podcast that this kind of thing creates, you know, it starts off pretty well, and then it's a bit like, no, I wouldn't trust that as my teacher of my students. But I think it's a significant worry. Unfortunately, I'm a very impractical person as a philosopher, so I never have very good answers to how we actually prevent these worries. I mean, I think you know, I think one thing is, I mean, you talked about calculators and banning calculators, and of course, there's the kind of parallel issue of banning, you know, that kind of content creation. But of course, with teachers, but of course, we actually don't want to do that because we want teachers to use these things in productive ways. So I think we really need strong systems for understanding, like, as LLMs develop, particularly LLMs right now, maybe it'll be something different in the future, but there's really no risk of teachers using other forms of AI right now because they mostly won't be able to. But you know, strong and continually revised guidances on how they're used. So I think this is going to have to be a significant part of education in the future, that we really figure out structures for teachers using LLMs. I think the worry is not getting them to use it. Maybe it's getting them to use it for specific kinds of things. We might need to incentivize that. But it's also regulating the use in other things and trying to do that in a way that actually works. And I think that's a big project, and one we're just starting. I mean, we see it a bit in the universities, but I think it's going to be a huge thing in lower educational institutions too.
Thank you. So just to follow up on this, and we kind of moving on to, or I would like to move on to the questions about risks, because this is just to elaborate on the potential risks, because this is a big part of the discussion that is happening within the area of AI Ed, and this is something that teachers are particularly worried about. So, Tom, if I can come back to you, in your presentation, you were talking about particular forms of AI in education. You mentioned Bloom and the 2 Sigma effect. It's a very particular way of engaging in teaching and learning, the mastery learning. And I'm just wondering whether so there are all sorts of risks that we are talking about in the context of these kinds of technologies which are already existing, and more broadly in the context of AI. We all heard about bias and privacy and misinformation and so on. I guess in the AI in education systems that are designed specifically for AI in education, the misinformation, we would hope, is a bit more reduced than in the kind of the more general AI applications. But should we also worry about other forms of risks? For example, that if we adopt particular kind of approaches, pedagogical approaches, so for example, this kind of mastery learning approach, to take your example, are we risking that AI may actually reshape education in undesirable ways? For example, by narrowing the experiences and the forms of learning that different students are engaging in? Are we responding to the needs on the ground?
I think there is a genuine risk that, excuse me, that when it's easy, we will do it, right? And when it makes the teacher's job easier, we will do it. And if we're smart, we will also measure the effectiveness in terms of educational outcomes. But if we're not careful about measuring the actual educational impact a primary consideration, then we'll default to the usual human thing of doing what makes my life easier. And that, like you say, that isn't necessarily what is best for students. Given human nature, I think we already do that, with or without AI. We all do it. Teachers do it too, right? There's a reason why they teach in a certain way and use these pre-planned lesson plans, and and they only have a certain amount of hours in the day to work, so they're already kind of working necessarily as an optimizer and an adopter of what makes things easier. AI is going to make certain things way easier, and so the temptation to jump on that, I think, would be great. I do think there's this kind of general confusion I have about how to think about education, because in even this short discussion here, there's a blend of what should we be teaching and how should we teach it as though we knew what it was that we should be teaching. And what AI is very good at is the second one of those. It's nowhere in the first one of those. AI is not going to help us figure out what we should be teaching. But if we can nail down and be precise about what it means to pass the course, what it means to be educated, then AI will help us figure out how to do it in the kinds of ways similar to what I was talking about here. But notice I said nothing, and I had nothing to say about how it's going to help us figure out what we should be learning.
Okay, that's I can see that, Matthew, you
Well, if Tom can't answer it, I haven't got any chance.
Do you want to come in on this?
I don't know what I don't know why there were certain things when you were talking, Tom, in different stages. I've written down, and one of which I asked you earlier, which isn't, I won't ask again because it's what if there isn't a right answer, but we'll come to that when we're older. Yeah, I mean, AI is nowhere on answering the first question, so that's going to take a much bigger effort. I mean, I think LLMs, to take one part of what we're talking about, need education more than education needs LLMs. So that would be like my first would be one of my sort of starting blocks here. And it sort of cuts back to the earlier point about data. So they want to get their hands on data. And now I've forgotten the original question. That's what I'd circled from what you'd said. But what was the original question? Sorry.
The original question was about, again, the kind of, are we responding to the needs on the ground, and what are other risks beyond privacy, misinformation, and bias that we may be missing in our discussions about AI in education?
Well, I think probably we're not looking at the bigger part of it, because it's if we want it to answer multiple choice questions, AI is going to be fantastic. If that's the point of education, then that's going to do it very well. I mean, I don't know about you. I wish I spent my day with 4 questions of which one was the right answer, but that's not my life. But
it's not your life.
It's not my life. Oh, yes, no questions. But I mean, even as it gets more, what is the point? Is it if we want to have a system of decorative learning with PowerPoint teaching, we've got that, and obviously there's a massive disconnect between what most learning scientists or whatever, I'm not sure what the latest term is, but for people doing research in this area, what they think and what a lot of teachers think is good education and what is going on. And we've had 20 years of that. So I think some of it is not just, this isn't just around AI. AI will do bits of that fantastically well. If we set it up to do, and it will deliver fantastic PowerPoints if that's where we want to go. It'll tailor-made PowerPoints for each student. But actually, maybe there are different artifacts we need to create rather than the essay. I mean, the essay is fantastic. Maybe the future, we're going to stretch into the future here, which is definitely Tom's domain more than mine. So I'll park that for the minute, but we'll come back to the future.
That's great. So actually, it dovetails really nicely to my next question about personalization, because personalization is one of those things that we hear a lot about in the context of using technology in education. I use technology on purpose as a kind of a broad category, but with AI, providing these special capabilities to adapt in real time, right? So Ivana, this is your kind of interest as well in personalization. Sticking still with the risks, potential risks, how do we ensure that personalized systems, or systems that can personalize, actually do stretch the learners rather than confining them? Because there is this big question around who actually decides what personalization looks like in what contexts. Could you maybe tell us more about how we can think about personalization in this context?
Yeah, so again, coming back to like that already exists in in human life, that kind of risk, in human teaching. It's a kind of actually quite famous effect called Pygmalion effect, where the teacher starts and gets this initial impression of a student, and then based on the initial impressions can actually pigeonhole students. So if a teacher thinks a student is very clever, teacher will teach one way. If they don't think that, they'll teach another way. It's actually a very good exercise. I think you should try it with if you have, and you're going in teacher meetings and when you talk about your kids, if you next time tell about their hidden talents and you gently guide the teacher. I mean, I've been doing it for all of my 3 children. And I can tell you that it is creating an enormous effect. I mean, I can see that my daughter, who was extremely insecure, thought she's nothing in maths. But I kept saying in those meetings with the teacher how she was born extremely intelligent, because she was premature, 34 weeks. So they were actually measuring the intelligence and brain development. And I kept saying how she was measured, her intelligence was measured. She was just extremely intelligent as a baby already. So the teachers organized special private tutorials for her to guide her to overcome her insecurity. Now when she's in high school, she's top in maths. The girl who would start a problem and give up immediately because she's not good enough. So this is very well known. And so again, like I said, so what's the problem with AI? It's not that AI will create this. Again, AI will amplify this. So while one teacher can do this to 30 kids in the class, AI with one model can do that to millions. So that is the problem that we need to solve. Again, coming back to the design table, awareness of existing educational pitfalls. This is why we need educational scientists with us at the table when we're creating AI tools for education, to tell us about these pitfalls and find ways to overcome it. So at the top of my head, I can think for this kind of situation, is that teachers shouldn't be focusing, the AI tool that the children are using should be, there should be a button, challenge me more, marks shouldn't be the measure, but maybe the change, like how much a student is improving, maybe the teacher should be aware also of the confidence interval of the prediction rather than just what the algorithm thinks. Maybe this, if the teacher knows that that algorithm is not very certain about a certain kid, then the teacher should be knowing that. So there's a range of different ideas that could be used in designing. And I think those should be done. So this is again just one example of a risk and how we could solve that with AI.
Okay, so sticking with the risks, just for just one moment longer, because obviously we are concerned about the risks. Daniel, very quickly, because we are running out of time, but I really want to ask this question of you, because your work...
Optimize.
Yes. In your work, you're looking at large language models. I mean, you specialized in language, and you highlight how large language models have surprising general reasoning abilities due to the special properties of these systems. But if this is the case, so in particular you talk about the language is the capacity for the abstraction, if I understand correctly, and that this makes reasoning tractable for large language models. So if we because obviously we want to know about generative AI, and we also want to know about the role of large language models specifically in education. This is a very hot topic. If language's abstraction is what makes reasoning tractable for large language models, might we actually stare down the face of a risk in the context of education, of actually flattening perhaps some of the richness, contextual richness, and the context sensitivity and the kind of relational and social emotional dimensions that are core to educational experiences, if we apply these technologies in those contexts?
I mean, yes. I'm going to be very brief. No, but I think...
Great, thank you.
But I think, look, if you're really giving a large part of education to large language models, which I think would be a very bad idea now, and I think you do risk picking up the kind of particular intellectual qualities they have based on the fact that they're reasoning on they're working on statistical frequencies in language, which is obviously a massively powerful thing, but we don't know how much in our own minds we're using other things as well. And in education, how much we're using other much different and richer source of information, the social, the emotional, even just the visual. I mean, even large language models trained on visual information that's still encoded through language and abstracted away in certain ways. So I think basically the answer is, of course, we don't know. But yes, there's massive risk. It's not to say we shouldn't use them in education, but we don't want to just kind of hand over education to large language models, even if they look pretty good, because that's part of what they're trained to do, is look perfect in the domain they work in.
Great, thank you, and thank you for very efficient response. Very briefly, Matthew,
Stop picking on me.
Sorry. I'm sure you will have a great answer. Very briefly about the benefits, and I know that there is a slight imbalance in the time that we dedicate to risks versus benefits. Beyond efficiency, can AI generally foster deeper learning and traits that teachers are particularly interested in, such as curiosity, creativity, or critical thinking?
Yes. I mean, I think it's an amplifier. So yes, if the teacher is interested in that and they choose tools that are interested in that have been developed trust with researchers who are interested in that, and no, if they're interested rather than in diagnostics, in profiling, which is a real thing, and you probably already have Googled it, but they're profiling kids like this kid is most likely to cheat, and that will come up on a kind of score. I mean, I think I've seen one like this person is most likely to be a thief at sort of 14, or it's input output, and that is also true of, like, that's not just I don't just mean on the AI data sense. It's the input of what's the desire, what's the desired outcome. So again, we're back to the bigger question, but that's a small question for the teacher, and the ecosystem helps people get there. Because otherwise, you don't know. You're too busy as a teacher to know this. So you need some kind of framework or rules of engagement that that when you're getting these tools, they're within a band, they're within tolerances of not doing that stuff. Like, we can get rid of that stuff quite easily if we want to.
So we are going back here to what Ivana you have been talking about, also how we design these systems, and also the entire infrastructure around the ecosystem is a word that keeps coming back in this context. Okay, we are pretty much out of time. Just one more question to all of you, very quickly. This is super speedy reflection on the vision beyond here and now. So looking ahead to 2030, I don't know why it's 2030, maybe even beyond. If you had a magic wand, what does AI in education looks like to you? Tom. Oh, shall we start with Tom and then just do the round?
I think two things. One is what I talked about for homework style problems, systems that the more they teach, the better they teach, and they will get very good at doing that, whether we want to do that or not. But it's what we're doing today. That's part of, we can do that. The other thing is completely different. There are two kinds of education, more than two kinds of education problems. Two that I'm thinking about. One is the unwilling, forced learner, kindergarten through 12th grade. They'd rather be playing soccer, playing with their friends, whatever. But they're going to do the homework because their parents force them. The other is the willing, interested learner, which in many cases is adults doing their job and they need to learn something so they can do it better and they care. I think the other part of what AI is going to do is really, really help those interested, willing learners, even more than it's going to help the unwilling, forced learners.
Great. Ivana.
For me, it's actually, I think, invisible coach that could help us discover our potentials and then make us brilliant at them. You know how many students I have? The most common conversation that I have with my students is, I don't know what I'm good at. I don't know what direction I should take. I don't know what my talents are. And imagine if you had that kind of invisible coach, something really easy, simple, that's why I'm saying invisible, that can probe you in many different directions. That is not about teaching, it's not about learning the knowledge. You know, Google can do that. It's even beyond learning the skills. It's about discovering what's inside you already. It's about looking for many different roads and kind of guiding you and discovering and just kind of seeing what is your road. And once you discover that talent, that thing that you love doing, and then giving you more and more of that until you become brilliant at that. And imagine being able to do that for every single child. So imagine that kind of world. I mean, this is my vision of what AI can do.
where education is beyond what we now think of education.
Brilliant. Matthew?
I had an answer, but Ivana just like made me cry.
I thought you talked before the panel.
She didn't say any of that. She was saving that for all of you. To steal another one of the words, amplify best practice. And the teachers are learners. So you want the teachers who want to carry on learning. One thing we didn't mention with this is continuous professional development, that AI can be really superpower. So I think like incentivizing the system with a better exam system will mean that not everything is being taught to the exam. That will radically change. If we want to move from declarative learning to active learning, which everyone talks about, and project-based learning, we need different exams. Possibly something in that is around kind of collaborative exams, or even like Viva style, oral explanation of what you've done, so we can get different perspectives on it and not just basing everything on one style. Because I agree, coursework is problematic.
Great recovery.
Daniel. Like Tom, I divided it totally into two different things. Maybe I'll just, the extremes are maybe primary and then, adult, even university level and later in life. I think the adult university level will just take care of itself in a way. It's already there to an amazing extent. You can just use AI and learn about stuff in ways you couldn't before. But I think that, the primary stuff, say primary school where my children are, I'm less ambitious than Ivana, but I think it's 2030. It's pretty close. Things aren't moving that fast. But I see my children and the teachers just weighted down in routine stuff. Teaching math, teaching reading, these are basic stuff for so much of the time of teachers, and they're not doing the engaging with students in social, emotional ways, building group works. And I think this stuff is really crackable. I think by the stuff that Tom talked about, I think AI is really good at basic routine stuff. We know it automizes things. We know, teaching reading is not, it's a science now. We know how to do it. It's doing the same thing again and again. And I think AI is just going to make that so much better, so personalized, so much faster. And I think the potential for the non-AI part of school is going to be unlocked by that. That's my optimistic vision. Is in fact, like, it's about that when AI takes over some of this routine stuff, then human beings can do their things in ways that they want to do in the rest of the time. And I think that will be just amazing. I think that's possible even in that pretty short time frame.
That is very optimistic. Thank you. Thank you very much for your vision. Visions. I think we have reached the. There are questions in the audience. We have reached the end of our part. Are there any questions?
Can I just, sorry, I'm the CEO of a small trust of 3 schools, Surrey, South West London. I just want to do a bit of reassurance on behalf of teachers, because a lot of what we've heard today has made teachers sound like they're very passive in the journey of new tools arriving. Teachers have always had a selection of tools to pick up and put down. Twinkle in primary schools was going to dominate the world and everything was going to be delivered through that platform. Teachers looked at it, they picked the best bits, they put it down, they moved on. And they'll do the same with AI, they'll use the bits. I think it's quite right, there'll be bits that'll be really helpful for them. I think the concept that we will all passively let AI take over what happens in classrooms won't be true. If you meet a former student, they won't talk about what they did on a computer, they won't talk about the textbook, they won't talk about the brilliant lesson that happened on the interactive whiteboard. They'll talk about the trip to France, or they'll talk about the swimming lessons they had, or mucking about in the back of a coach on a bit of field work. There are bits that AI will never get to, they might help with, but reassured that teachers, great teachers, will continue to provide the heart of our things work. For the teachers.
Thank you very much for this intervention. It's really good to hear that, and I don't think even if it came across as if we didn't know that. we do know that, and it's very, very good to hear your perspective in this context. It's very much needed. Talking about talking of ecosystemic approach. So it's very much part of that kind of thinking. Do we have time for one more question? One more question?
Can I just on that note, I'm just going to add one thing that is very important, and that's long-term engagement. I mean, long-term engagement with any of these tools, actually not just in education, but also in healthcare and in other systems, it's actually quite challenging to achieve that, because it's not obvious how we as humans are going to adopt these tools, because it's not obvious what is it that's actually helping us with. And I think only when that question is answered, that when it's really helping us with something in a qualitative way, and when we are incentivized to use it, then that's going to happen. So it's really going to take a Steve Jobs kind of person of AI in education, somebody with a really brilliant idea of how to put something into our life, like iPhone is, that is in regards to, for example, in this field that we are going to use and do. And right now, I don't think any tools around have been created that can be that kind of imaginative to figure out how we as humans work, and in education especially. And so I think it's going to watch this space. Maybe we just don't know the answer right now, how this is going to happen, but it will require some really creative thinking.
Thank you. We have one more question from the audience.
Hi, thank you. Professor Mitchell, as you can tell, I'm American, and I'm thinking about the American context. Your illustration at the very beginning of your talk is very persuasive. The power of the tutor and increasing educational attainment for a specific student. So thinking in the American context, perhaps this applies elsewhere, where you have wealthy school districts and poorer school districts, I'm wondering how to apply this in a way that is benefiting everyone and not increasing the disparities in education between poor and wealthy education systems, where everybody can apply it, everybody can excel, everybody has the same access to it. I'm wondering whether you or anybody else wants to address that.
Great point. I think that access is maybe the most important part of what you're talking about, just making sure that people do have access. And I'll give two examples. The Squirrel AI company, which is in China, has found that it's especially rural school districts where there aren't advanced teachers in each of the high school subjects that benefit the most from this kind of technology. CK12 has recently been spending a lot of time in rural parts of India working with school districts there. And their belief, they don't have the data back yet, but their belief is that that's really where some of the biggest impacts can make. But it at least depends on access. But one thing that I think is common to both of those examples is, it's especially in districts where maybe you don't have the full collection of advanced biology, advanced physics, advanced chemistry teachers. And so these kind of systems have been found to be particularly useful there. That's not American.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to our panelists today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I think we came to the end of this panel. So let's just thank our panelists for their wonderful contributions.